Hello everyone! In this lesson, we will implement permissions and logic and restrictions for our custom API endpoint. We're going to pick up right where we left off in the previous part of this lesson. The very first thing that I'm going to do is give myself a clean slate. What I mean by this is in the admin dashboard, I'm going to click on likes in the sidebar, and I'm just going to delete all of my existing like posts, because several of these were just weird tests and experiments with fake data. So just click this checkbox up here to select all of them, and then choose bulk actions, move to trash, click apply, and then we can even empty our trash by clicking on trash here, and then click empty trash. Cool, so at this point we've deleted all of our like posts, and now we have a clean slate. Now let's work on our first goal for this video. Let's set things up so that you need to be logged in with a user account in order to create a like post. If you're not logged in, we just want to completely ignore your request. So to set that up, let's jump into our text editor, and within our theme folder, let's look inside the INC subfolder and jump into like-route, and let's find our create like function. And let's do this. Right up at the very top of this function, let's write an if statement. So if parentheses, curly brackets. And for the condition check, in certain situations, you would want to see if the current user can perform a certain capability. So in that case, you could say current user can, and then within those parentheses, you can include the name of some capability. Right, so remember with our note post type, we set up custom capabilities, and they would have names like publish note or something along that line, right? And then that would either evaluate to true or false based on the current user and their role. So that's one way of doing it that I want you to be aware of, but we don't need to use that for now. So let's delete that. And for our condition check, I don't care which role you have or which specific capabilities you have. If you have a user account whatsoever, that's good enough for me for you to create a like. So for my check, I'm just going to say, is user logged in? Okay, so this will evaluate to true or false. If it's true, we can just copy and paste all of this code to live within these curly brackets. We can do that in about 10 seconds from now, but if this is false, if someone is not logged in, then after the curly bracket, let's say else, curly brackets. If you're not logged in, let's cancel the current request by saying die. And then within the parentheses, let's say only logged in users can create a like. Okay, but if you are logged in, then let's move all of this code to live within the if statement curly brackets. So I'm going to select this line and our entire WP insert post chunk. So with all of that selected, just cut it into the clipboard and then paste it within these if curly brackets. Okay, and before we save this, let's review what this function is going to return in either case. If you are not logged in, the server will respond with this message. But if you are logged in and this code runs, we also want to be sure to return something so that the server sends back a response so that we have something to see within our JavaScript. Now, luckily, this WP insert post function, if it is successful, it returns the ID number of the new post that it just created. So right before this WP insert post function, we can just say return. Okay, now let's go ahead and save this and test it out on the front end. So go ahead and navigate to a professor detail screen. And if I click the like box and then check my console, if I expand this object and scroll down to the response text, we see only logged in users can create a like. Now at first, this could be very confusing because we are indeed logged in with our admin account. So why in the world are we seeing this message? Or in other words, why is the is user logged in condition check evaluating to false? Well, in one word, the answer is nonce. Even though we are creating our own custom API endpoint, the overall WordPress REST API has still got our back. In other words, within the context of a REST API callback function like this, This condition is never going to evaluate to true, and WordPress can never trust that we are who we say we are unless we send along a nonce code with our JavaScript request. So let's go update our JavaScript to do just that. So within our theme folder in the JS modules folder, let's open up like.js, and let's scroll down and find our createLike method. Here it is. And within the Ajax call, we just need to pass along our nonce code. Now we've already set this up in a previous JavaScript module, so in order to save a ton of typing, let's just copy and paste and borrow from within our mynotes.js file. So within the mynotes.js, if you scroll down and find our delete note method, within the Ajax call, remember that we set up this before send property. And this is where we wrote the code to send along a secret nonce value so that WordPress can trust our request. This proves that we are who we say we are. So let's just copy this entire before send chunk from here down to the closing curly bracket and comma. Let's copy that into our clipboard, and then back in our like.js file within the createLike Ajax call, maybe right above the URL line, add a new line, paste in your clipboard. Okay, let's go ahead and save that, and let's go test it out. So back on the front end, be sure to perform a hard refresh. And now if I click the heart box and check my console, cool, the post was successfully created because we see an ID number. Remember that we are returning the results of our WP insert post function. Now a bit later on, we will set things up so that the heart box updates on the fly in real time. But we have not set that up yet, so if I want the like box to update, I can just perform a refresh. Cool, so the count increased from 0 to 1, and now the heart is solid and filled in, to represent that the current user account I'm signed in with has already liked this professor. And just to test out our code, why don't we try to visit this same professor page in a private window where I am not logged in to any account. So programs, biology, Dr. Barks a lot. Uh-oh, so I see a problem. If this browser window is not logged in, then why would the heart be filled in? This doesn't make any sense. And it's actually a problem that's being created from a tiny mistake I made in a previous lesson. Right? Because we would expect a logged out user to always see an empty outline of a heart. So in order to fix this, let's jump into our text editor. And I want you to open up single-professor.php. Okay, let's scroll down until we find the main span that has a class of likebox. And the problem here is that data-exists is being set to yes when it should be no. Now the cause of this problem has to do with our exist query that we wrote. Remember, this is where we checked to see if there are any like posts that like the current professor you're viewing that were created by the currently signed in user. Now the problem and confusion here is being created by this getCurrentUserID function. If the current visitor is logged out, this function returns a value of 0. However, within the context of a WP query, if you say author equals 0, well, that's the equivalent of just not having this line at all, right? And it's going to query for posts regardless of the author. So let me put that line back. And the way around this issue is right above this query line and right below this exist status equals no, let's set up an if statement, if parentheses curly brackets. For the condition check, let's say is user logged in. Okay, and then let's just move this entire query as well as this if check to set the status to yes. Let's move all of this to live within this if statement. So that way we can entirely avoid the situation where author would equal 0. So I'm just going to select from here down to here and cut that into my clipboard. And then within this if statement, just paste it in. Okay, so if I save that and then refresh the window where I'm not logged in, perfect. You can see the heart is no longer filled in. And that's what we would expect to see. But it does remain filled in the window where I am logged in. specifically with the user account that did the liking. Cool, now let's move on to the next restriction or piece of custom logic that we want to enforce, which is we only want each user account to be able to create one like per professor. So let me show you how I would set that up. Over in the text editor, let's jump into our like-route file, which lives in our inc folder. And within our create like function, right below this line where we create our professor variable, and right above this line where we return WP insert post, let's set up a new if statement. So if parentheses, curly brackets. For the time being, when it comes to the condition, let's just write a bit of fake code or pseudo code that we can fill in with real PHP a bit later on. So let's say if like does not already exist. Obviously, this is not valid PHP code, but this is just a note for ourselves. So if a like for this professor does not already exist, then within this if statement, we would create the new like post. So just add a comment, create new like post. But on the other hand, if a like does already exist for this professor, then down here, let's say else, do something different. So if our else runs, let's cancel the current request and say die, and let's pass along a message that says invalid professor ID, right? Because you are trying to like a professor that you've already liked. Okay, next, let's replace this comment. So this is where we actually want to create the new like post. So let's just move this code to live right here instead within the if statement. So I will select from return down to the two closing parentheses semicolon, cut that into my clipboard. Okay, and then if our condition check here is true, let's remove the comment and paste in our clipboard. All right, and now let's actually work on our condition. Now, believe it or not, you and I have already written code that can determine if a specific user has liked a specific professor. So check this out. Let's jump back into our single-professor.php file. And the good news is that we can just recycle this exist query, right? Because if this query finds any results, that means the relevant user has already liked the relevant professor. So let's just copy this into our clipboard from the beginning of exist query down to its two closing parentheses semicolon. Copy that. And then back in our like-route PHP file, right above our new if statement that still currently has the pseudocode, right above that if, let's add a new line and paste in our clipboard. And we only need to make one adjustment to this query. So within the meta query, when it comes to the value that we are looking for the liked professor ID field, within this context, we can no longer just say get the current ID. Instead, let's delete that, and what we are looking for is our professor variable, right? Because that's where we've stored the professor ID that our JavaScript request has sent along. So down here within our meta query, let's just say value equals our professor variable. Okay, and now that we have this query in place, we can actually set up our if check. So let's delete this fake pseudocode. And let's say if our exist query, and let's look inside it for a property named found posts. And let's say if that equals 0, so if the current user has not already liked the requested professor, then go ahead and create that like post. Else, otherwise, return this error message. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So back on the front end, let me jump to a professor that I have not already liked with this user account. Okay, so if I try to like Dr. Meowsalot and check my console, cool. So my initial request is successful, but if I try to click the like box again, now in my console, I see this message. And if I expand it, the response is invalid professor ID. Perfect. So each user account can only like a professor once. Now, before we bring this particular video to a close, let's implement one more check within our PHP. Before we actually go ahead and create a new like post, let's first make sure that the ID number they are sending over actually belongs to a professor, and that it's not just a bogus made-up number that either doesn't exist or that actually belongs to a blog post or a campus or an event or program. So to set that up, all we need to do is add a second condition within our if statement. So right after our if exist query found post equals 0, still within those parentheses, let's just say and get post type, and let's try to find the post type for whatever ID JavaScript is sending over. So within the parentheses for get post type, just say professor. That's the name of our ID variable. And then let's say if that equals professor, right? Because if this equals post or page or campus, or if it equals nothing, if it's just a made up ID number, we don't want to create the like post. So only if that equals professor do we want to run our code. So let's go ahead and save that, and then I'll show you how we can test this out on the front end. So let me visit another professor that I have not liked yet. So go into math. For me, that's Frogerson. I haven't liked that professor yet. And if you right click on the like box to inspect it, and then for the data attribute named data professor, you can double click on the number and just enter something totally random. And then push enter to confirm that, okay? And now if I click on the like box and check my console, perfect. It looks like that request failed, and the response is invalid professor ID. Cool. So in this video, we set things up so that first of all, you need to be logged in to create a like. And then we also enforced that each user account can only like a professor once. And finally, that the ID number that you're sending over actually needs to belong to a professor. Now in the next and final part of this lesson, we will update our JavaScript so that when you do successfully add a like post, the like box count and heart update in real time on the fly, so that you don't need to manually refresh the page. And we will also create a function on the server side that allows users to delete or remove a like. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you then.